So a moment ago, I asked you to talk about someone who has been influential in your life. But now I want to, in essence, flip the question. And instead of talking about people that have been influential, hopefully in a positive way, in your life, I want you to think about this. What does it take for us to be those kinds of people? What does it take for us to be the kinds of people that have an influence, a positive influence on others? Now, I realize when I raise that question, your first thought may be, well, I'm not that kind of person. I mean, other people, maybe they're more outgoing, I'm not that kind of person, or they're natural leaders, I'm not that kind of person, and I'm not wired that way. But if that's what you're thinking, please understand the Bible is filled with all sorts of people that were used by God to have a positive impact, a positive influence in the lives of others. And sometimes they're surprising people from difficult or different kinds of backgrounds. And arguably this morning, Exhibit A is the woman we've been looking at over the last couple of weeks. Her name is Esther. So if you have a Bible, I'm going to ask you to turn with me to Esther chapter 4. Esther chapter 4. Now, as we have seen already, in so many ways, Esther was vulnerable. In so many ways, she was powerless. She was an orphan who was raised by her relative Mordecai. She was a Jew living as part of those who were now living in exile in Persia. And she was a woman. In many ways, you would say she was a woman in a man's world. And not surprisingly, through much of her story, the truth is her life up to this point has been shaped by the decisions of other people. Some good, some not so good. And maybe for some of us, maybe that's some of the ways in which we look at our lives. We feel in so many ways our lives have been dominated by the decisions, the actions of other people. Perhaps some good, perhaps others not so good. And maybe in some sense you feel boxed in because of that. And if you feel that way, perhaps you can identify with Esther. However, as we come to chapter 4, it turns out her vulnerability is not the end of the story. Here we're going to see things begin to change in her life. Here we're going to see that her life isn't simply defined by the actions of others, but she's now going to become someone who takes initiative. Initiative that will be interested or instrumental in saving the lives of many others. So what happened? I mean, given her backstory, what factors were at work in her life that this could be the rest of her story? That's what we're going to talk about this morning. So with those questions in mind, let's come to chapter 4. Now, let me just give you a quick review of what we've seen so far. As I've said, she was a young Jewish woman who had been raised by Mordecai. And even though she's in exile, she was ultimately chosen by the king of Persia to serve as his queen. And at that point, it seems to be a wonderful Cinderella story, but then it takes a dark turn because there's a guy named Haman, a prominent government official, who's been deeply offended because Mordecai, the Jew, does not bow down to him in his presence. He doesn't acknowledge Haman's importance the way other people do. And because of this slight, Haman has plotted to kill the Jews living in the kingdom. And he's convinced the king to go along with this idea. So this is where we pick up the story as we move into chapter 4. And here's what we read. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out to the city wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When you see that reference to sackcloth, maybe it's helpful to think of something like an ancient grain sack. It would clearly draw attention in public. It's almost like today going out wearing a trash bag. And this was a traditional sign of mourning that we see elsewhere in Scripture. And notice, as the word spreads out, as the king's decree spreads out to the various provinces of Persia, there is a similar response in all of the areas, as Jews respond with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Pay attention to that phrase. We'll come back to that in a moment. And perhaps part of Mordecai's motivation was this, to get Esther's attention. I mean, she's now in the palace. He has no access to her. Well, if that's the case, it worked. Because as the scene unfolds, word gets back to Esther about what Mordecai is doing. I mean, the people around her knew that she had a connection to this guy, and now he's drawing attention in public. So she sends new clothes to him, but he refuses. Then she summons one of her attendants, a guy named Hathach, to go find out what's wrong. And as you read this passage, it's almost funny because this guy ends up going back and forth, right? He's getting in his steps as he's at the intermediary between these two. So Hathach goes out to investigate what's bothering Mordecai, and we read these words. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. So Hathach brings back this word. And notice, first of all, it's information. I want her to know what's going on. And interestingly, you'll note Haman actually had insider information. Remember, he's a government official. I think he's well connected. He knew all the machinations that had led to this edict. And so he explains that to her. And so not only does he give her information, but then he gives her instruction. Now, Esther, you need to go in and beg the king. You need to plead on behalf of your people. And as we read further, when Esther hears this message, initially she refuses. And she had good reason. You see, she had been summoned into the king's presence for 30 days. And I think what is implied there is this. Now that they've been married a few years, the king has moved on. The infatuation stage is over, and there are other women in his life. Furthermore, she knows that if she takes the initiative to go and see the king without being summoned, she's actually risking her own life. If he refuses to see her, she could be executed. Now, this may sound unbelievable, but there's actually evidence, ancient historical evidence outside the Bible that says, yes, this was the protocol in Persia. If you sought an audience with the king without being invited, if you showed up to see the king and he chooses not to welcome you, that could be the end of your life. So Esther hears this message from Mordecai and in essence says, look, no thank you. And she sends Hathach back. Well, Mordecai hears her response, but he's persistent. He won't take no for an answer. So he sends back this reply. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. And I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Mordecai says, don't fool yourself. You can't escape this. But he also says, and who knows if all of the things that have happened to you haven't been leading to this point, for such a time as this. And this time Esther agrees. And we begin to see a shift in the story. Because this is the last time Mordecai will command Esther. From now on, it's Esther who is giving the instruction. And the plan moving forward will be hers. And she tells him to have the Jews fast for 3 days and 3 nights. And she said, I'm going to do the same. Then we're going to go and see the king. And so 3 days pass. And that day of reckoning comes, and she gets up. And she puts on her royal robes. And she makes her way through that large palace, which has actually been excavated in Susa. And across the inner court to the king's hall. I can only imagine what that walk was like. Have you ever found yourself going into an important meeting or an important conversation that you know could have a level of conflict or disagreement or tension at work, at school, with a family member? And as you walk into that situation, it just feels, every step feels labored and heavy, and there's just knot in your stomach. Do you know that feeling? Just think about Esther walking through that palace, walking across the court, entering the king's hall. And when he sees her, he held out his scepter to welcome her. Even though he had ignored her for a month, at this point he is glad to have her company. And he asks her what she wants. He's in a good mood. He's in a receptive mood to Esther. So tell me what you want. And she says this. My petition and my request is this: if the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. Her request is simply this: for the king and Haman to join her for dinner the following evening, and she will give him more information along the way. And the king agrees, and we'll see what that entails next week. But meanwhile, we are given one other fascinating detail about Haman. He calls his wife and his friends together. Remember, he's just been invited by the queen to have a dinner with her and the king alone. What that must say about his prominence. So he summons his friends and his wife to give them the good news. But this is what he said. He boasted to them about his vast wealth and many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above all the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, he added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me all along with the king tomorrow. But then get this. But this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate, who refuses to acknowledge me and bow down to me every time I walk by. Now at this point, I think what the author is doing is he's giving us this fascinating contrast. On the one hand, in real time, you were beginning to see Esther's life move in an outward direction. She has concerns about the risks she's going to take, but she is willing to take those risks because of her concern for other people. By contrast, even as her life is moving outward, Haman's life is moving inward. I mean, he has all this wealth and privilege and opportunity, yet all of that is being shadowed by this internal need to have the approval of this one guy he feels is slighting him. Now, as we watch these things unfold, there's one trait. There's one factor that I think is becoming evident in Esther's life. And it's instrumental in what's going to happen. It's instrumental in her becoming a person of influence. And if you and I are going to become people of influence in our circles, in the spheres where we live, at times we're going to need this factor, this character trait as well. What is the trait that I'm talking about? Well, I think it's courage. Maybe to define that a little further, courage, it's the faithfulness, it's to act in faithfulness in the face of risk. Right? What's courage? It's just faithfulness in the face of risk. When she decides to go to the king, that involves clear risk. But she embraces it. Now, with that in mind, let me ask you a hard question. When was the last time you made a decision that took courage? When was the last time you made a decision that truly was a step of faith? Now, hear me clearly. I'm not saying that as followers of Christ, for those of us who know Christ, that this is just going to be an everyday experience. But I do think there are going to be moments. There are going to be seasons. There are going to be situations in our lives where being faithful to our relationship with Christ involves risk. It involves courage. Now, perhaps we would say, well, the truth is, I'm just a more cautious person. When you think about the descriptors that describe me, courage is not the first one that comes to mind, right? Maybe you'd say, I'm just more cautious, kind of more structured, and that's not me. And I get some of us maybe are more risk averse than others. But I want you to see, this book shows that God can use surprising people in surprising ways. So let me just make very briefly 3 quick observations about how we can develop courage. 3 observations from this text. The first is this: I think we develop courage as we embrace God's providence. Now you might say, wait a minute, God isn't mentioned at all in this passage. In fact, as I've said before, he's not mentioned at all in this book. This is the only book of the Bible that doesn't mention God at all. Yet remember what I think the author is doing here. The author he's challenging us to understand that God is omnipotently present, even when he seems conspicuously absent. And as we see various twists and turns in the story, and what we see at times are these coincidences that seem to pile on to further coincidences, I think we are being encouraged to understand that God's providence is at work every step of the way. Let me just show you one clue I think the author gives us in this text that this is true. For a moment, think about a movie that is out right now. Spider-Man. How many of you seen Spider-Man? Brand New Day? Okay, no spoilers then. So, if you are a fan of the Marvel movies, then you may know this, but Marvel has this great tradition of putting Easter eggs in their movies. And by that I mean subtle props, clues, hints that are actually references to other Marvel movies or other points in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. One YouTuber has actually documented over 100 Easter eggs in this recent Spider-Man movie. Now, I tell you that because you actually find a similar phenomenon in the Bible. Places where a text alludes to or echoes another biblical text. If you want a technical term for that, it's called intertextuality, like one text alluding to, echoing another text, so that this text in some sense is drawing your attention to something that has been said before. And I think one of those echoes, one of those Easter eggs, is actually in this passage. Remember, I read it a moment ago, that when the people throughout the provinces heard about the decree that Jews were to be killed, there was fasting, weeping, and wailing. That series of 3 terms occurs at one other place in the Old Testament. It's in Joel chapter 2. And I've highlighted how they're translated in this passage, but it's the same 3 texts, it's the same 3 terms in the same order that you read in Esther. This was a time when Israel was under stress, and here's what we read: "Even now declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. Rend your heart and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he's gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love, and he relents from sending calamity. Who knows, he may turn and relent and leave behind a blessing, grain offerings and drink offerings for the Lord your God." This was a scene where, again, Israel was facing a crisis, and the people are told, to weep and mourn, to come to God. But in coming to God, they are reminded of his character, right? He is gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in love. And guess what? If that sounds familiar, that's actually an echo of another earlier passage coming from Exodus 34, when Moses encounters the presence of God. And I think the author expects his readers, his hearers, to have some familiarity with these earlier texts. And so with this subtle link, as he tells us this story, it's like hovering above all that goes on is this understanding of God's character. He's at work as the one who is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in love. And I think that's the context in which we should read Mordecai's statement. Who knows if all these things haven't happened for such a time as this? And perhaps that's another echo from this text, because the text asks the same question. Who knows? Esther, I want you to embrace this moment, because we believe God is at work. Is the one who is gracious and kind. So be willing to step out in faith. Now, here's what I think is fascinating about this truth. Sometimes, when we talk about God's providence or God's sovereignty, we may say, well, you know what, if God is at work, if he's going to do what he's going to do, it just doesn't matter what I do. In fact, you may think that believing in God's providence means my decisions are unimportant. But notice in this text, embracing providence does not lead to passivity, it leads to purpose. Esther, because God is at work, and we know his character, embrace his providence, embrace this moment. So I think part of developing courage is just embracing the reality of God's providence. I think also, secondly, to develop courage, you need to embrace your identity. Again, there's an important phrase in this section, right? Remember what Mordecai tells her? He says, I want you to go to the king, and I want you to plead for your people. I think it's a fascinating phrase, because remember how Esther is introduced in chapter 1. She's introduced with 2 names. She's the only person in this book introduced with 2 names. We're given her Hebrew name and her Persian name. And in many ways, those 2 names set up a tension that is running through the pages of this book. And the tension is this: Esther, what's your true identity? Already at 2 points, we've been told that she has kept her Jewish identity a secret. And candidly, that may have been important for her own survival, but now she is faced with a choice. Her history, her heritage is as a Jew, the people God has chosen to bring his mission to the world. But her context is Persia, where she now experiences the comforts, the privileges of being queen. So as you see this scene unfold, I think an underlying question to Esther is this: Esther, who are you? And whether you realize it or not, as we go through our regular routines and responsibilities, as we make everyday choices and decisions, an underlying question is this: who are you? If you are a follower of Christ, are you embracing that identity? That's part of developing courage. Finally, to develop courage, embrace your responsibility. As I've read this text, to me, one of the most gripping parts of the dialogue is this. When Mordecai tells her, if you remain silent, relief and deliverance for the Jews will come from another place. Now, I've got to be honest with you. This statement and parts of this book raise all sorts of questions, even very technical questions about the relationship between divine and human action. And the text doesn't give us answers to all the questions we may ask, but in simple terms, I think this is the point that Mordecai is making. Mordecai is saying, Esther, you have an opportunity. You have a responsibility in this moment. In fact, various things in your life have brought you to this situation. You have this opportunity. You have this responsibility. But if you choose not to take it, God will send deliverance through some other source. God will accomplish that through others. And I've got to be honest with you, I've been working with this book over the last few weeks. This has been maybe the part of the book that's really challenged me. Because it's challenged me in the area of saying, what if you don't take those opportunities? What if you shy away from the responsibility God is giving you? What if you miss out on the ways in which you can be part of his plan? As I've been kind of noodling on that, I think one of the ways this passage has challenged me is just this. Just to embrace, this is simple, but it's just to embrace the opportunity to connect with people in conversation. Because I realize sometimes there are opportunities in front of me that I just overlook. Maybe avoid. Certain conversations it's just easier not to go deeper or to ask the next question. Sometimes it's just easy to avoid conversations. And I've really been challenged working through this book to think in those terms. So with that in mind, last Monday night, I was flying back from Texas where I'd been visiting family over the weekend. It's a late night flight. I was seated on the aisle. Seated next to me was a college student. Seated next to her was her mom as we're getting settled in to pull away from the gate. Her mom is a little frustrated because her phone is dying. It's running out of juice. Well, I always carry an extra battery. And so I pulled this out. And I said, hey, just use my battery. And she was just kind of shocked. I think it was a little shocked that I was talking to her, but shocked that I would offer that. I said, look, my phone's fully charged. I always travel with this. You just use it. So she did, and she used it during part of the flight. And that just kind of opened the door to conversation. And we just had this fascinating conversation. As it turned out, they had been visiting family too, so we just talked about certain family dynamics and what that entailed. And in the course of the conversation, talking about dealing with family, I just talked about, I said, I'm a pastor, and I talked about some of my experiences. And when I told her I was a pastor, she looked at me and she said, I knew it. And then she said this, and this was the money line. She said, there is gentleness in your eyes. I know. All I could say was, I can't wait to tell my wife. I got home and said, I told her the story and said, it's time to put these gentle eyes to bed. I said, you're not going to hear the end of this. Now, that was a fun conversation. But you know what? As I reflected on it at a more serious level, I thought, I don't want to miss out on moments like that. And it just caused me to realize there's some things I've missed in my life because I was unwilling to take that step. There's some things I miss because, it's easy to be faithful, but then you get to that point where the next step involves risk, and so you move back, and instead of acting in courage, you act in comfort. So let me ask you, what about you? Are there steps that God is challenging you to take right now? Steps that may seem scary because they involve a risk. But maybe whether you realize it or not, there are places in your life right now where certain things from your past have led to this moment. A moment, an opportunity, a responsibility for you to act in faith. For some of you, maybe it's, you've heard us talk about Jesus and all of that. Maybe it's taking the step, beginning the journey of following Jesus. Maybe it's taking a step and having a hard conversation that you've avoided. Maybe it's being courageous and being more intentional in investing in certain relationships. Relationships where it's just easier to be superficial and transactional. Maybe you've been attending our church and you know what? Now is the time to take the step of saying, I want to be a part and I want to join, and it's time for you to explore membership, and that class is coming up this week. Maybe it's being more open about your faith in relationships where you just are very intentional in avoiding that topic. And maybe at times it's simply willing to be different in how you do certain things in your life. Maybe it's willing to be distinctive and not just go with the flow of some people around you because it's safer and it's more comfortable. And who knows? Who knows that in different ways the storyline of your life hasn't been leading to this moment for such a time as this. I'm going to pray for you, and then after I pray, I'm going to invite our prayer counselors to be available here at the front. For you, those of you joining online, we can pray for you. We'd love to know that as well, and just know we are available to do that with you. So join me in prayer. So Father, as we've been tracing this story of Esther, we come to this powerful turning point. And we see the courage that she exercises, this faithfulness and being willing to take risks. And I pray, I know for some of us, maybe there's some place in our lives right now where we're just hesitant to take that step because so often it feels that comfort is so much easier than courage. But with that in mind, I pray we would know that you promise to be with us every step of the way. I think Esther's step of courage was rooted in your providence and your faithfulness, and that permeates the pages of the book. So may we hear that message clearly this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. So our prayer counselors are going to be here at the front. If we can pray with you, we would love to do that. Maybe it's in an area where you need to take a step and just to pray with you about having wisdom to do that well. Now as you go, I pray you just continue to be challenged by the story of Esther, and that her story will encourage you to be a person of courage. Amen.